So my name is Nicole Santiago. I'm a research analyst at Trilateral Research, and my background and interest as a human rights lawyer is specifically in connecting ethical principles with binding legal frameworks, specifically human rights frameworks. So it is certainly my pleasure as we begin to conclude this final SIENNA conference to briefly present on some general thoughts on translating ethics to law, and additionally how to engage with policymakers in the process of doing so. Whoops, I went too far. Okay, so the agenda, I'll begin with a couple words here on the challenges and opportunities of regulating new technologies. Then I'll say a bit more about connecting ethics and law specifically. And then I'll end with some reflections on generalized learnings from engaging with policymakers based in part on our experience in the SIENNA project. So simply put, we are in many ways building the car as we drive it, in the sense that we need to develop governance mechanisms in parallel with the development of technologies. And the rapid pace of technology development, often outpacing decision-making processes, makes this even more challenging. As a result, depending on the technology domain or application, there's a number of challenges that we confront. One is no applicable or limited existing legal frameworks. Another challenge is a lack of consensus on definitions related to technologies. A great example of this is artificial intelligence, where we have no universally accepted definition. There's also the challenge of undefined roles and responsibilities, specifically with questions about who should regulate or govern, and then at what level, whether that's international, regional, national, or local, as well as questions and corresponding tensions in respect to the rights and accountability of different stakeholders, including developers, deployers, and users. Additionally, as these technologies are emerging, we don't yet understand or appreciate the impacts and risks, particularly those of medium and long term. And lastly, and I think this is especially relevant to engaging with policymakers, there's often no common language. Policymakers and lawyers on one side speak, in legalese, very technical legal language. And on the other side, developers and industry have a common understanding of technical terms that isn't shared. Therefore, without someone to translate and build common understanding, it's almost impossible to develop effective governance mechanisms. But all of these challenges, I think, present to us as researchers a lot of incredible opportunities for engagement. In particular, there's opportunities for us to feed into discussions on identifying core values and principles. I went too far again. Identifying core values and principles, assessing risks and impacts, defining roles and responsibilities, and most importantly, perhaps prioritizing the types of governance models and how those governance models should be implemented. So the challenges specifically of connecting ethics and law, and particularly ethics to human rights, there's a lot of talk about translating ethics into law, which is an incredibly important discussion and a key part of many conversations with policymakers. However, we risk oversimplifying this very complicated and nuanced task if we simply try to equate law and ethics. It's very true, of course, that ethics shapes law, but we have to keep in mind that ethical principles alone are not legally enforceable. And to ensure that ethical principles can inform law in a constructive way, there's a number of steps that we have to take first. One is that we need to figure out how to translate ethical principles into legal rights, so into that legal language. Additionally, we have to develop precise language. This goes back to coming up with definitions, for example. We also need to clearly identify roles and responsibilities. And lastly, we have to think about how to establish or to designate governance bodies and create or strengthen enforcement mechanisms to ensure that the law can be effectively implemented. All right, so generalized learnings on engaging with policymakers. All of these specific topics present opportunities for engagement with policymakers to support this really kind of challenging work of translating ethics into law. I'm going to present some general findings or general learnings, I should say, that was drawn from our experience in SIENNA. We also looked at how other related projects, specifically projects funded at the EU, engaged with policymakers, and particular projects with a focus on ethics, human rights, and new and emerging technologies. Note that this is not a systematic review of best practices. It really is just kind of an overall high-level assessment of what works and what didn't work. However, I think it's a useful reflection nonetheless. Just as a quick bit of background in the SIENNA project, We had two tasks that focused on engagement with policymakers. One was to obtain buy in from EU and international organizations, and the second was to develop a sustainability plan for the tools and frameworks we've developed. In the process of doing so, we participated in a number of targeted public consultations and developed policy briefs, which we sent to selected policy making bodies. And we did both of those at the international, EU, and national level. So, just some generalized takeaways from our experience. The first set relate specifically to identifying potential opportunities. The first is to really take some dedicated time to understand the full range of key actors and the different decision making processes that are involved in policymaking at those individual at that actor level. This involves kind of mapping out all of the individuals and the organizations with influence in relevant policy areas, and then weighing up their potential for influence on a particular topic. It's important, I think, to remember that there really isn't a one size fits all approach in the sense that every decision making body has a different mandate, has different decision making policies and procedures, and therefore will require engagement in different ways. The second takeaway is to develop and maintain networks, which means making connections with people who share a policy interest and a relevant policy interest in ethics and human rights, both in person and, as we know now, online. I think additionally to optimize engagement, the network should include, wherever possible, policymakers themselves who can help direct you towards additional opportunities and facilitate the engagement. And of course, we're lucky in this SIENNA project to have the Commission as both a client, but also as part of our network of policymakers. The third takeaway was to be really aware of the political context. It's critical to understand how the research that you're doing and that we did fits in with current thinking. And it's with this relevant context that you can frame recommendations to be more relevant and also to potentially have better uptake because they be able to be considered more serious. Lastly, is to time the engagement right and utilize windows of opportunity to make the most of engagement with policymakers. This requires monitoring for opportunities like open public consultations and calls for feedback on policies and law. Okay, the second set of takeaways relate specifically to actually engaging once you've sort of found those opportunities. Once again, not a comprehensive list, but some of the general learnings that we had through our experience in Siena. The first, and perhaps maybe the most important of all of these, is to communicate in ways that policymakers find useful, which means to have tailored and targeted communication and messaging. You have to consider your audience and make practical recommendations, which means writing in clear and concise language, which can be often challenging for us as researchers, and using the formats specifically stipulated by the people that you want to engage with. Additionally, recommendations should be as practical and realistic as possible, considering resource constraints, government priorities, and any current political narratives. The second takeaway is to really know and appreciate and be able to communicate the value add, to be able to explain what it is about bringing an ethical and human rights perspective to the table. What is it about that can assist in decision making and problem solving? The third takeaway was to adopt a long term perspective to engagement. For greater impact, we kind of have to adopt the mindset that you may need to engage multiple times and be open to requests to reiterate recommendations or to modify the format of communications. That's not to say to modify the content of recommendations, but if a policymaker comes back and asks for something in a shorter document or in something more like a policy brief, being open to requests like that so that you can get your message across in a way that is, again, tailored to the policymaker. Fourth is to be prepared to invest significant time and resources into the process of engaging with policymakers. It takes time to develop and maintain relationships, to develop your recommendations, and then to communicate them. There's just no way around it. Effective engagement with policymakers requires dedicated time and effort. And lastly, is to take some time either periodically or at the end, sort of to reflect on engagement activities and to follow up with the policymakers to see what happened as a result of your engagement. Not only is it rewarding to see how your feedback contributes to the decision-making process, especially to see if your recommendations have been translated into any new policies or law, but it's also worthwhile to spend a little bit of time reflecting what worked and what didn't, and whether or not, if you came back to the same policymaker later, if you would be able to tailor your approach slightly differently. So, kind of in conclusion, so a very brief presentation here. In conclusion, while there are a lot of challenges to regulating new technologies, those challenges present incredible opportunities to researchers, including opportunities to shape discussions on identifying core values, defining roles and responsibilities, and prioritizing types of governance models. And part of those discussions is translating ethics into law and figuring out how ethics and human rights connects to law. It's true that law is shaped by ethics, but ethical principles alone are not legally binding. So that takes a lot of significant work to make that happen. And this is the opportunity where we can come in as researchers to engage with policymakers. However, that engagement will require dedicated time and resources and must be tailored in order to be effectively and received well by those with whom you are engaging.